Good morning.
Morning. Morning.
One of the things I always like to do is to start out a sermon with a little story, and one of the code phrases that you may be familiar with is the following. Once upon a time, there was a tourist wandering around an Indian reservation, and he walked over to one of the residents and he said the following rather seriously. "White man, glad to see red man. White man, hope big chief feel tip-top this morning." The Native American looked at him in amazement and then called over his shoulder to one of his neighbors, "Hey Jake, you gotta come here and listen to this bozo. He's a trip." Stereotyping people that we know little about is one of humanity's worst habits. And yet we all do it, again and again, to some degree. And in turn, we are all at some time victims of it. Native Americans have certainly suffered more than their share of such abuse. The book, Songs from This Earth on Turtle's Back, contains a poem. It is called Sure You Can Ask Me a Personal Question. It is written by Diane Burns, and in it she quotes the imagined responses to yet another ignorant tourist by one importuned Native American. After the tourist makes embarrassing questions, the Native American responds with these little lines. "No, I don't know where you can get any peyote. No, I don't know where you can get Navajo rugs real cheap. No, I didn't make this. I bought it at Bloomingdale's." "Thank you. I like your hair too." "This ain't no stoic look, lady. This is my face." Now, thank goodness we have all come a long, long way since 1869. Maybe one or two of you will remember this, when U.S. Army officer Philip Henry Sheridan expressed the then prevailing view, the entire American prevailing view, when he told Comanche Chief Tuckaway the following, "The only good Indian is a dead Indian." Remember that? Having become aware that over a century of dishonor took place in which white men, mostly men, lied to, stole from, and murdered thousands of Native Americans, most of us have matured enough to find some humor in the comment of Will Rogers, himself part Cherokee, when he said this, "I have just enough white in me to make my honesty questionable." Now, issues of good and bad tend to be ethical matters. And so this morning, what I thought I would do for you, because this month marks one of the anniversaries in which, well, most people don't celebrate it, but in which we moved Indians onto reservations. So this morning I thought what I would do is share with you some ethical things that we might learn from Native Americans if we overcome the kind of prejudice that lies in the hearts of those who think in stereotypes. Since America's indigenous peoples practice several different kinds of ethics, what I have done today is I have chosen to focus upon Navajo ethics in particular. Now, over the course of human history, as you may know, people have created a multitude of diverse ethical theories. But among all of them, they fall into two large categories. On the one hand, there are theories which determine what is supposedly right and wrong based upon an analysis of consequences to any action. Now, these theories have a name. They are called, among scholars, the teleological type of theory, from the Greek term telos, which means end, as in the relationship of means and ends. Now, utilitarianism is perhaps the most famous of these teleological ethical theories, and because unitarian-universalists tend to stress deeds, not creeds, you've heard that, of course, teleological theories tend to be very popular among us. Now, the other broad category of ethical theories is very different. It does not consider consequences in deciding what is good or what is evil. Instead, it bases its judgments upon either obeying or disobeying certain rules, or doing or not doing certain actions. Now, these are called deontological ethical theories. And this category includes, as some subsets, conscience theories, intuition theories, natural law theories, and Immanuel Kant's very famous categorical imperative. Now, however, by far the very most commonly used deontological theory is something called divine command. And Navajo ethics is an example of it. Now, throughout history, most human beings have never, unfortunately, studied these many different types of philosophical ethical theories, but most human beings have at one time or another, or in some way or another, been religious. And so, consequently, most people have and continue to have some form of experience with divine command theory in determining what is right and what is wrong. Now, you and I, deal with this every day. We can't avoid it. Positively, we experience it each time that we encounter an honest merchant, a helpful volunteer, a friendly neighbor, or even a polite stranger, all of whom behave in socially constructive ways because that is what their religions have taught them to do. Unfortunately, we also experience it negatively each time a fundamentalist rises up to ban a book, or a zealot kills an abortion doctor, or a fanatic blows himself up in order to kill innocent bystanders. Now, from such examples as these, there ought to be an obvious fact appear to us, and that is there are many pros and many cons to divine command theories. We also need to know that there are different kinds of divine command theories, and each has its own advantages and disadvantages. In a book that I particularly like, Ethics, A Pluralistic Approach to Moral Theory, ethicist Lawrence Hinman sorts all of these things out, and it is from him that I get most of my information this morning about Navajo ethics. Hinman uses Navajo religion, Islam, and Buddhism to illustrate the three major types of divine command ethical theory. So let me go through those very briefly. Islam represents the type that most of us are familiar with, which would be monotheism. In any monotheistic religion, an action or intention is good or evil only because it obeys or disobeys whatever the deity in question supposedly commands, based upon the belief that this deity is the only deity, monotheism, and is omnipotent, omniscient, just, good, and loving. Now, for monotheists, it does not matter at all whether the command seems rational or irrational, nor whether the consequences seem to be helpful or harmful. That's all irrelevant. The only thing that matters is that their God has commanded something, and to be good, they must do it. Now, Navajo religion represents polytheism, the polytheistic kind of divine command theory. Doing the right thing in polytheistic religions is not quite as simple as merely obeying the commands of a deity, because when there are many deities, some of them are morally good, but some of them are quite evil. And so, if you were to obey the commands of the evil ones, you too would become evil. Now, to give you an example of that, we might remember the word thug. You ever use that term? That term comes from a bunch of religionists, the Thuggees, who were an early 19th century bunch of religionists in India who worshipped the Hindu goddess Kali, and in obedience to her divine commands, they went out on the roads and highways of the time and they killed innocent people by the scores. Now, Buddhism represents non-theistic divine command theory. It has no notion of a personal or individual God at all, but instead it represents an ethic of compassion in which the alleviation of suffering and the purification of the soul become the principal concerns. The commands in it are divine, not because they come from any deity, they don't. They are divine because they possess inherent sacredness and are salvific to the individuals. Now, let us return for a moment to Navajo ethics, because I think you will find there are some very interesting things in it that we can say in general. First, for example, over the centuries, Navajo ethics was largely oriented toward guiding the actions of Navajo toward Navajo. That is, of people who knew one another or were related as family members somehow. Now, that is very unlike traditional Western ethical theories, which are primarily directed toward regulating the behavior of people toward strangers. Very different approach. Now, while this probably improved Navajo internal relationships, it also inevitably created difficulties for Navajo relationships to outsiders. That's one thing. Second, Navajo ethics was almost exclusively practical in nature. Traditional Navajos had virtually no interest whatsoever in what we would call theory, nor in anything that would look like abstract questions or hypothetical situations. This was probably due to the fact that at the time these ethics were formulated, they had no written language, and they passed along all of their traditions orally from person to person. Now, I don't find very much helpful to us in these first two characteristics, but I think there is much of importance that we might learn from Navajo ethics' third major difference from Western ethics, and that third difference is this: the general absence of antagonistic dualities and the pervasive presence of a desire for harmony. Now, most Western ethical theories are filled with what scholars refer to as antagonistic dualities. To give you some examples: body versus spirit, emotion versus reason, sensuous inclination versus duty. The tendency in those kinds of systems is to require that a person choose one of those dual partners as being good and accept the other as being evil, and therefore try to avoid the latter. Now, in Navajo ethics, you have a very different system, much more like Eastern religions, Buddhism, Hinduism, Confucianism, Taoism, which tend to see things in terms of yin and yang, necessary but mutually supportive opposites. Now, like those religions, Navajo ethics seeks to embrace both sides of any dualism, of any antithesis, rather than choosing one or banishing the other. And this is because when one exists without the other, it is incomplete. Now, the principal tension for Navajos is that of male and female. And virtually everything in the Navajo world is considered to be, in some fashion at least, either male or female. Together, both sides create a dynamic union in tension. Now, another basic tension that Navajos recognize is that between good and evil. These, however, these two things, good and evil, do not exclude one another. Instead, the Navajo believes each needs the other. Hinman says this: in large measure, evil, like good, just is for the Navajo. This is found in their view of a person's character and in their view of the everyday world. People, as they understand people, are a mixture of good and evil, and there is very little that one can do about that. Similarly, evil exists in the world, and its presence is as necessary as the presence of goodness. A Navajo might look for ways to avoid evil, But a Navajo would never think of trying to create a world without evil. Now, the principal goal of Navajo ethics is, therefore, something which is called HOZO, H-O-Z-H-O. Did you bump into that one? Look that one up in your Navajo Funk and Wagnalls. Or on Google, whichever's handy. Now, HOZO is translated in a variety of ways. All of the following terms apply: harmony, beauty, peace of mind, goodness, health, well-being, and success. Navajos seek a dynamic harmony with their environment that is characterized by a proper balance of all things. And the function of morality, as they understand it, is to guide individuals toward achieving this very balance by marking out alternatives that prevent the achievement or maintenance of that harmony. This harmony must be achieved at three levels in our existence: in the natural, in the human, and in the supernatural. Now, it is especially in the first of these that we can see some obvious differences, I think, between Navajo ethics and the traditional Western approach. Whereas the Western approach has been based upon, and I know you know this, the Bible's exploitative model from Genesis 1:28, wherein the Hebrew deity supposedly gave humans, quote, dominion over all things. The Navajo view is very different. It is not one of controlling nature, but of living in harmony with it. Now, to give you an example of how that works out, think about flooding on a river. The Navajo and the traditional Westerners respond differently. Westerners tend to build a complex dam. Navajos simply move to higher ground. Now, the Western biblical view portrays humanity as being truly separate from and over against nature, as if nature were merely a tool for humans' indiscriminate use. The totally different outlook Native Americans have has been expressed by the Shawnee chief Tecumseh. You may have read about this encounter during negotiations to prevent open hostilities. An aide for William Henry Harrison, then governor of the Indiana Territory, brought in a chair and told the chief, "Your father, General Harrison, offers you a seat." Tecumseh replied this way, "The sun is my father, the earth is my mother, and upon her breast will I lie," whereupon he stretched out upon the ground. Now, another Native American, Chief Seattle, from whom our great city is named, said it even better. He said, "The earth does not belong to man, man belongs to earth. All things are connected, like the blood that unites us all. Man did not weave the web of life, he is but a strand in it. Whatever he does to the web, he does to himself." Now, we Unitarian Universalists have learned that, and we have tried to acknowledge this wisdom in our seventh principle. How then do the Navajo determine how people should act? Well, they learn some behavior, as do all people, from the myths and the stories that are part of their oral tradition, but they also have a more important resource. They call it the holy wind. Now, it escapes our normal dualities. This holy wind is physical, we can feel it on our faces, and yet it is ephemeral because we cannot catch it. It is pervasive, it's always there with us, but it is shifting in its direction and its intensity. It is one, like the ocean, but it is many, like the ocean's drops. The holy wind, they understand, comes from the four directions, and it is associated with the four mountains which they perceive to have been where the deities supposedly dwell. Some Navajo myths say that this wind even created the world. But the holy wind, and this is very important, the holy wind is not a deity, nor is it the voice of any deity. It is not a being, it does not think, it does not will. Instead, it is merely a sacred, natural force that guides individuals, much like conscience or intuition. When it is needed, it makes itself into what they call the messenger wind, or sometimes the little wind, or the wind's child. It swirls around and it enters the individual through a hidden point in the ear. Once inside, it warns individuals of impending dangers, discouraging them from pursuing courses of action that would upset their hoso. Thus, it is mostly a negative urging of avoidance, and only rarely does it provide positive direction to what their action should be. Now, individuals are completely free to ignore this holy wind. Unlike Western religions, this wind never punishes anyone who disregards it. Individuals may in fact suffer the natural consequences of their foolish actions, but there is no divine, final, or everlasting reckoning. The Navajo call any person who heeds the warnings of this holy wind one who lacks faults. And they say this about such a person: this person who lacks faults thinks in a good way. He thinks well of one. One thinks well of him. He usually smiles, comes up to one slowly, and shakes one's hand. One who lacks faults does not argue with another person. He does not steal. He is not mean. Nothing bad is said about him. He is obliging toward everything. Now, as I have said before, Navajo ethics is very practical. Its basic premise is simple and is this: life is very, very dangerous. And from that starting point, several fundamental guidelines emerge. They include the following: maintain orderliness, which is to say harmony. Be wary of non-relatives. Avoid excesses. When in a new situation, do nothing. Escape. Now, these suggestions may seem somewhat odd to us, but in the original Navajo context, they constituted great wisdom. Being wary of non-relatives, for example, had the very obvious advantage that one gets from intimately knowing the people with whom one is dealing. And also there was this little fact: Navajos believed in the existence of witches whom they assumed were evil, and they understood that witches could move around among them much more easily and not be recognized if they were not relatives. Now, as for doing nothing in a new situation, this arose both from a fear of the unknown and from their respect for harmony. On the one hand, as animals and people who live close to nature know, safety is often found in remaining still and quiet. Rather than trying to control a situation, one tries to remain untouched by it. Now, on the other hand, Navajos understood that if they found themselves in a new situation, then it was they who were the foreign and potentially disharmonious element in that environment. As such, it made perfectly good sense for them to wait until they understood their new setting before trying to re-establish harmony. Navajo ethics recognize that disruptions in harmony are unavoidable. Illness, death, and catastrophic events will always come and bring disharmony. Navajos therefore had several procedures to try to restore harmony. Chief among them was the use of rituals, especially some of which involve repetitious chanting. Now, outsiders might have perceived these to be monotonous and boring, but Navajos found them to be a source of order and safety and a way to return to the proper balance of things. Now, some contemporary Native Americans have found fault with white folks and their current interest in Native American ways. For example, Mary Bravebird has written the following: "Our religion and ceremonies have become fads and a fashionable pastime among many whites who are seeking for something that they hope will give meaning to their otherwise empty lives. after macrobiotics, Zen, and channeling, it is the poor vanishing Indian that they have taken up as the subject of their new, deep, and meaningful conversation in the high-rises. Now, in her article, The Sacred Seed of the Medicine Tree, Linda Hogan, and we saw a picture, by the way, of a Hogan, which was kind of neat. Linda Hogan expressed a somewhat different concern. She says, "It has seemed so strange to me that the larger white culture, with its own absence of spirit and its lack of attachment to the land, respects these very things about Native American Indian traditions without adopting those respected ways themselves, however." Now, this irony was pointedly summarized in Paula Gunn Allen's little book, The Sacred Hoop, when she said this: "An odd thing occurs in the minds of Americans when Indian civilization is mentioned, that odd thing being little or nothing." Now, I don't think either of these problems is a problem for Unitarian Universalists, because we have been very careful and we have actually passed through the little or nothing stage of apathy without having become faddish. And in between those two extremes, we have developed what I think is a very healthy respect for the wisdom that exists in Native American culture, such as the Navajo ethic of balance and of harmony. We have even included within our hymnal, as you well know now, a section of readings from Native American spirituality, as well as at least one hymn. Now, I want to close this morning with one of those readings, which is a prayer which says the following: "Grandfather, look at our brokenness. We know that in all creation only the human family has strayed from the sacred way. We know that we are the ones who must come back together to walk in the sacred way. Grandfather, sacred one, teach us love, compassion, and honor, that we may heal the earth and heal each other." Amen.